sky's not something that we can touch. It always recedes from where our point of apperception or perception is. You stand on the highest mountain, the sky is still moving away from us. So it's untouchable, but it's a representation. There's an analog there for how we experience the inner world. Our dreams, we experience them, but to touch them in outer life, waking life, it's almost as impossible as touching the sky. So there's a resonance there potentially between the representation of within and what is without, particularly on the sky. If the ego starts to look inwards too much in a too concentrated way, then the pressure that it feels on the inside starts to break the ego down, and then when it turns around and looks back on the outside, it projects that into the environment. The environment is threatening. It populates the outer world with the inner forces which are pushing against it. We can see then how information is trying to represent itself through projection and transference. So what the psychodynamic people call ego consciousness. It's trying to represent itself. It can't get through. There is some kind of dynamical resistance, which we know what that is. That's complexes and dissociation. So it projects into the environment as if to say, if you won't see it in yourself, see it in the other. That's an opportunity. It's like a culture which had not experienced a ship or a 19th century steam train. Then they will project something that they find meaningful onto that based on their innate capacity to do so, obviously. Past learning, ancestral learning, religion, myth, anything which is big enough to try and explain something new and apparently overwhelming, and it just shoots out. And that's the projection and transference. Now, if we scale that, and this is a thought experiment, obviously, but if we scale that to the potential for the product of a very, very advanced civilization that may have access to physics beyond what we can even imagine in terms of capacity to travel and to generate objects that move apparently against the known laws of physics, then what will we do? We'll do something similar, which is that we will do everything we can to understand this according to our individual experience, our cultural experience, and our genetic predisposition. So you will get a confused summation of projections and confusion, which is linking everything. Confusion will be the thing, because that's how trance states form. And when people are in a natural trance state, there's a kind of a void or a gap. The Tibetans, for example, call that a bardo, an interval between thoughts and time. And into that, something comes which tries, in the form of a symbol, to summarize the whole thing and say, just accept that, that will do. It's outside of our capacity otherwise.
Hi everyone. A quick note before we launch into today's video. Applications for CADA 5 of our IPSA professional training course are now open for start in September 2022. If you feel that you have a calling towards depth psychology or psychotherapy and would like to train professionally under Steve and Pauline Richards in psychosystems analysis, then you are more than welcome to apply. We really look forward to reading your application. Check the link in the description and pinned comment for the application webpage. Thanks everyone. Now, onto the video.
Hello James, nice to see you again.
Absolutely, it's good to see you too, Steve.
So we have an interesting topic today that can be looked at in a number of different ways, can't it, really? The psychological and the perhaps not psychological, as in whether it's real or not, or a mixture of both.
Yes, a topic that's been around for a very, very long time, but seems only recently, from some links you've been sending me recently, these things have been started to be taken more seriously by sort of the more mainstream establishment types. So yeah, I'm sure we can come at this from an interesting angle, especially I think the more psychological side, because I've not seen any actually content on YouTube or on Google going into the UFO or UAP phenomenon from a psychological angle properly. So this could be good fun.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting as a cultural phenomenon. People who believe that they're following Jung, you would think, wouldn't you, with the recent revelations about what these phenomena may actually be, you'd think they'd be all over that and go immediately back to Jung's book, Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies, and then say, look, you know, well, that's not happening, as you say. At least it's not gotten to the more popular realm. I'm not personally aware of any Jungian analysts who are talking about this either, which is interesting. And I wonder whether it's because, to some extent, the potential reality of these things, whatever they might be, appears to be getting closer and closer to being realized.
I think so. I think so. I mean, Jung starts that text off with a talk about pretty much Ion, really, and the coming of the Aeon of Aquarius, which probably would put a lot of people off straight away in terms of being taken seriously. But one of the things I've seen that people have found fairly confusing, and I completely understand why, is when Jung describes these strange flying discs in the sky and talks about them as being a projection of some kind, or at least to some degree a projection. I think one of the questions that comes up straight away is how can multiple people project the same thing on the same object? That's where I've seen lots of conversations like shut down and stop, and then people will veer off into other things like just general synchronicity or ghosts or, you know, stuff like that. Yeah. Tricky one though.
Yeah, people will project, and they will project into things that aren't there. So they literally project their inner world into the outer world and populate it. And generally that gets called an hallucination, and a psychiatric hallucination, or it may be considered to be a paranormal, parapsychological phenomenon, or it may be a religious phenomenon. And people who have religious visions, they're called religious visions, very often have the same kind of quality to them as observations of so-called UFO or UAP phenomenon. So they're either all completely different or the same mechanism is involved. And knowing that in any individual case is always difficult, and we need a fuller context to understand. But people will always project. And if we assume then that some of these observations are real in that ordinary sense, people will still project onto things that are real and have no reality for that person other than what they project onto them. This is normal. This is what we do. Everybody does it, and we get it in depth psychology all the time through the transference. That a person, the reality of a human being is removed because of the strength of the projection and the transference onto them that insists that that person, the object of the transference or projection, must comply with that which is being projected. And that's a possibility with these phenomena as well, regardless of whether they're real in any independent way.
Okay, so that's kind of making a distinction then between these things could be very, very real, or you're just saying they could be kind of like sort of real. I think it's important, I guess, when you're saying about projection, by projection in this instance, you definitely mean something that's unconscious. So not someone, which sounds a little bit strange perhaps to say, but you've made the distinction before on YouTube and on Discord, that transference, for example, is always unconscious. Then as soon as it becomes conscious, it becomes something else.
Yes.
So the projection onto some kind of thing in the sky will be an unconscious phenomenon, and the person won't know that they're doing it.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. And there are a number of nuances to that. We should really define what unconscious really means, because psychodynamic theorists, depth psychologists, clinicians tend to collapse into a very special meaning for unconscious, which has some latitude of applicability, but it gets rather confusing. I actually prefer personally non-ego consciousness. In other words, it's a consciousness of a kind, but it's not that we usually enjoy in our daily life. It appears to be happening to us with respect to normal consciousness, and if we're aware of it at all, or the capacity to do it, we say that must be the unconscious. Really, it's just a non-ego. It's a form of information which has a degree of autonomy. Now, if information is so organized that it has an autonomy, in other words, it can behave independently, then we could argue that that is a form of consciousness rather than unconsciousness. Now, when we get to where I've made that specific distinction to say that you can't have transference unless you're unconscious of it, I'm collapsing, and quite deliberately so, into a psychodynamic model. From within the psychodynamic model, you have to say that. You have to say to someone, this is not transference. If you're aware of it, it must be something else. And that's to get people to think within that particular framework. However, the phenomenon, wherever it is independent of any collapsed method of understanding of that. So what's really going on is that which is really going on. And then we choose our model, we choose our way of understanding it. So if I was to say that the transference then has to be unconscious, I mean that the ego has to separate itself from acknowledging the fact that a part of the wider personality that is independently conscious is organizing itself and then transferring or projecting onto a third party. That's a lot to consider. Most people don't want to bother considering things with that nuance. So they'd much prefer to think, I didn't know I was doing it, therefore it's unconscious. And that's an ego not taking responsibility for itself. And as soon as a person does, through insight, take responsibility for projection and transference, then by the theory, it's no longer that. But the phenomenon is still the same. We've just increased the valency of the non-ego consciousness material. So it's now in connection, it's in association to normal reflexive consciousness. And that means that we are obliged ethically, all of us, to do something about that, so we don't abuse other people through our projections and transferences. So that's the general term. And when it comes to these UAP, UFO kinds of phenomenon and the related phenomenon that we discussed earlier, such as religion and so forth, then it's the same in the sense that people are largely not conscious in the normal sense of this other consciousness, which is insisting on making a connection between the inner and the outer. Okay. So there's a lot there, but if people can unpack that, they'll get a lot of understanding, and then that will help them to relax a lot more about what these things mean, and they can make cleaner observations of other people and of themselves.
Yes, yes, it allows for a sense of meaning to come through, as we've spoken about in recent videos, far easier than framing it otherwise. That when you're mentioning that there's something that's not on, yeah, it's when you say non-ego consciousness, it's not unconscious, it's conscious of its own kind, outside of the ego, that from its own I'm not meaning to personify or anthropomorphize, but there's a sense of meaning built into what is being projected. My follow-up question, though, would be, with these UFO or UAP phenomenon, these things have been observed by, and this is what makes them so interesting, I think we'll both agree on that, is that they've been observed by the military and by governments, and they've been caught on camera and all kinds of things, which means whatever one is projecting, if one is projecting onto these things in the first place, I'm going to go back to Jung for a second. When Jung talked about the UFOs being connected to some kind of archetype that was present in every person, it gets a little bit muddled, especially when he's talking about the coming of the Aeon of Aquarius and the coming of the Redeemer of the world and all kinds of things. But if we put it into more just real brief dialectical syncretism for a second with IPSA, if you put it in a meta-instinctual model, there'll be something in common with all of us that would have a tendency to project onto something like UFOs that gives a similar sense of meaning that comes with it cross-culturally, if that kind of makes sense.
Perfect, yeah.
Okay. If you kind of get what I'm getting at and asking there.
Absolutely, because it's the nuances of different aspects of consciousness that all operate at the same time that in an informational sense is so broad that we can't conceive of it consciously within our limited Miller number, which is the Miller number describes how much information we can process with normal reflexivity at any one time. We have to collapse. The thing is, though, that what collapses are several chunks of information with a degree of overlap between them and a degree internally of exchange of meaning between them that summates into something which we can in the moment live with, but we don't understand it. And that's why we remain unconscious with respect to the ego, because of the size and the bandwidth of material which is chunked together, ready for projection or for transference. And it's like a culture which had not experienced a ship or a 19th century steam train, then they will project something that they find meaningful onto that based on their innate capacity to do so, obviously. Past learning, ancestral learning, religion, myth, anything which is big enough to try and explain something new and apparently overwhelming, and it just shoots out. And that's the projection and transference. Now, if we scale that, And this is a thought experiment, obviously, but if we scale that to the potential for the product of a very, very advanced civilization that may have access to physics beyond what we can even imagine in terms of capacity to travel and to generate objects that move apparently against the known laws of physics, then what will we do? We'll do something similar, which is that we will do everything we can to understand it according to our individual experience, our cultural experience, and our genetic predisposition. So you will get a confused summation of projections and confusion, which is linking everything. Confusion will be the thing, because that's how trance states form. And when people are in a natural trance state, there's a kind of a void or a gap. The Tibetans, for example, call that a bardo, an interval between thoughts and time. And into that, something comes which tries, in the form of a symbol, to summarize the whole thing and say, just accept that, that will do. It's outside of our capacity otherwise. And for one individual, that will be religious, positively or negatively. For another, it will be science fiction. But the fact of the phenomenon in the case of UAPs transcends that, because there are independent observations not dependent upon human psychology that involve technology and multiple kinds of technology, which, for example, infrared, microwave, radar, optics of various kinds, simultaneously recording these phenomena according to their own bandwidth of capture and representation. So there is something there, and it's not entirely dependent upon human psychology. So that suggests that there's an element of reality there.
Yes.
But what's projected might be independent of that reality, depending upon who's doing it. And for that, we need to know the context of the individual or group of people who may be projecting and what their beliefs are.
That's a really, really good way of putting it. Just to bring the meta-instinctual stuff or the archetypal stuff forward just for a moment, in your clinical experience, have you noticed any themes of things that are projected, independent perhaps of like a general human reaction of fear? But from what I've seen from lots of people online, it seems to be a sense of it being an omen. These things are omens. And I can't quite think at the moment what that would be per se as like an instinctual, I don't want to collapse too much here, but
yeah,
category, an instinctual category within.
Right. So
there's something that's common across lots of different people. That's interesting.
Are we talking generally now, or are we talking about the UAP phenomenon?
The UAP.
Okay, right. Well, the historical correlates for that, or the clearest one, would be a comet. Comets have always been taken to be portents of change. Halley's Comet, of course, there's the famous comet of 1066 in the UK that occurred before the Norman conquest. And there are others. And changes in the environment that are that significant, particularly in the sky. The sky is not something that we can touch. It always recedes from where our point of apperception or perception is. You stand on the highest mountain, the sky is still moving away from us. So it's untouchable, but it's a representation. There's an analog there for how we experience the inner world. Our dreams, we experience them, but to touch them in outer life, waking life, it's almost as impossible as touching the sky. So there's a resonance there potentially between the representation of within and what is without, particularly on the sky. Also, changes that do occur in the sky, for example, weather. Whether that might be caused, for example, by a volcanic eruption or any other phenomenon like that, tends to be so overwhelmingly powerful we can't do anything about it. Mm-hmm. And that's a similar resonance we get with a change from within ourselves. For example, if somebody's descending into a mental illness and the kinds of representation that appear internally in terms of, for example, paranoid ideation, delusions, primary and secondary delusions, when somebody's slipping into schizophrenia, the fragmentation on the inside means that the ego is overwhelmed and can do nothing, it's overpowered. So there's a correlation between that and the environment, when the environment becomes overwhelming, and particularly when it's in the sky or perhaps the sea. The sea's another one. And tsunamis that have been experienced in the past by cultures where they get the drawback of the wave from the beach, and then this thing comes in and it keeps coming in. Of course, then people pick that kind of thing up in dreams and they report a movement in the dream, and they feel something on the inside that may be psychological, it is moving. There's an analog, there's correlation, a projection, an internal projection, and these things tend to balance out in representational form. It doesn't mean that the inner world is the same as the outer world. What it does mean is that the ego is primarily intended to interpret the external world and not to look in. And when it does look in, it's looking in a strange place. And the unconscious under normal conditions does not want to be messed with. It wants to regulate itself and then push things towards the ego for it to test in the outside world. But if the ego starts to look inwards too much in a too concentrated way, then the pressure that it feels on the inside starts to break the ego down. And then when it turns around and looks back on the outside, it projects that into the environment. The environment is threatening. It populates the outer world with the inner forces which are pushing against it. So as humans, we live in this state constantly of being pressured from both sides. Mm-hmm. And that's why we've evolved an ego to try to deal with that. And mostly it works for most of us, most of the time. But then if we get these changes that occur in the environment, in the sky, and particularly an object like a comet or a UFO, UAP, then people say, what's the analog? And that's the meta instincts. Now, meta instincts are downstream, as we know, of Pankseppian ones. They provide scenarios. They're very ancient and they are largely inherited, but they get modified according to cultural pressures, cultural learning, into the specific form that Jungians talk about when they consider archetypal images, or they should do, but very often they blur the boundary between the image and what they think is the archetype in itself. A typical mistake a Jungian will make, therefore, is to project the archetype in itself through the image and into the environment and start to see the archetype as such everywhere. Mm-hmm. They fail to make a distinction between the image, which is a dialectically produced thing. We call them resultant images, as you know, in the RPSA model. They fail to make a distinction between that and the archetype in itself. So we get mixed up. And then we have, oh, there's the image of a reified, wise old man, and he's out in, or whatever, in the environment. Well, that's a projection of a concept into the environment. And it's actually disguising the real thing in and of itself through the projection of the image and saying the image is the archetype, and it isn't. And Jung was clear about that, even from within his own model. So you get a similar dynamic, again, with something that appears on the outside to have resonance with something that's on the inside, and then they connect. Now, they do connect, obviously, because people do this, and they've always done it. So what's the purpose of the connection? To some extent, it's just adaptation. We need to adapt to changes in the environment externally. But the inner environment wants us to adapt to it by making it real in the world. So this is why we have instinctive pressure. Instincts push. They need a context or a scenario. And as I was saying just before, the meta instincts then update themselves according to what's going on in the environment. And the result of that update is what, as you know, we call a deep structure complex, which includes a representation of our belief and our adaptation to the outside world. So when we look in, we see that. So a Jungian will always find Jungian things when he or she looks inside. A Freudian will find Freudian things, and an Adlerian things, and so on. And they don't communicate. The deep structure complexes of a Freudian and a Jungian, in respect of what they see on the inside, are based upon their beliefs and their learning rather than what's actually there. Mm-hmm. And what we need to do is to get beyond the internal projection of the deep structure complex into the true meta instinct. Then we can begin to sort out what we're doing. And at that point, we can stop projecting in a way that Jungians might call archetypal.
Well, on that, thank you for that, Steve. On that Jungian archetypal side, something that can be slipped in, right, or I sense can be slipped in through the back door, is the relationship or the jump between projection, as we've just been describing it, and synchronicity, and how the two, as definitions, can be blurred together. For example, when Jung spoke about astrology, of all things, suddenly that was all synchronicity rather than projection. But sometimes it was projection, sometimes it was both together, with that line being incredibly blurred. So it makes, it makes sense for something to be in the sky, and then there's a very organic explanation for why one might project onto it. But again, from your clinical experience, have you seen these projections of, say, the UFO variety or UAP variety cluster with synchronicities more often than, say, other things? If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Sure, that's a distinction which some people might be interested in hearing about.
Yeah, I'm going to have to pull away from that as a manifest surface structure, because the content of the kinds of projections you get into UFOs, so-called, or what people believe are UFOs, and other kinds of projection into things like astrology, because astrology, of course, is a representation in the sky as well.
Yes, yeah.
And they're not constant. If you wait long enough, the whole thing shifts and changes. But there are many other criticisms of astrology that are really valid, that show it to be only projection. So the projecting making factor, Jung said, was the anima. Now we would say that's relating. That's the relating function. The relating function, part of its purpose, obviously, is to make connections. So synchronicity is going to be active in that. But I think there's another way of explaining this, and this is my own preferred way, and this is how I fundamentally start when I encounter anything like this, and that is the superpositioning of information and its representation. So this explains superpositioning, what is within, so too is without. It also explains why information collapses into a specific representational form, because the conditions and the state under which it is represented is a collapse. And that's partially real in the sense that it's objective, and it's partially subjective in the sense that our perceptions and our transferences force this information to collapse. And then we see something that is either there or not there according to that dynamic, that subjective quality. But the reality of it is independent of our observation. And it's quite a simple thing to work out, because we're conscious of a lot of things, but we're unconscious, so to speak, of most things. And that means information is exchanging, energy is exchanging between different aspects of the environment simultaneously all the time in a wave form. This is what we call the wave form of informational representation. It's dynamic. It has an amplitude with its waveform as well. So sometimes, for example, someone will have a very high representation of a somatic symptom of anxiety, and others not. It disappears out the body, but it becomes something else perhaps. So you can see it's a dynamical waveform, but it is fundamentally the same thing, but it takes on the shape of its representation. So to go back to synchronicity then, for me, synchronicity is an extension of informational representation in the environment, because the waveform is shifted, and it shifts according to its own dynamics. And we know from the work that we've done together and the videos that we've done about how the so-called trickster function works, how so-called parapsychological phenomenon jump in on that, the synchronicities and so forth. But at bottom, we're looking at the movement of energy and information and its representation as an extended field of information in the environment. And if we don't know that, we will see things that we could interpret as being synchronicity as if it were woo-woo. But the thing that makes synchronicity work is that it's a so-called acausal connection principle. That means there is a correlation in time between an external event and an internal state. So Jung got that far with it, and he defined it well within the parameters of his times. But again, if we take the information theory model, then it is the same information, and that the way that he perceived of it collapsed it into the construct of synchronicity, which meant there were some gaps that are hard to close, so hard to see. So in other words, the conclusions that people come to on synchronicity are a consequence of the construct of synchronicity and not an actual observation of the phenomenon in and of itself. So we get problems when we think synchronistically. Now, if we know what that is, we can still use the term, because you mentioned dialectical syncretism, we can use the idea of synchronicity to model what is happening at a certain level of resolution. Doesn't mean we understand it, just means that we've collapsed into that frame of reference. If we know what the gaps are in synchronicity as a theory, then we can extend beyond that. but we're aware of what synchronicity is supposed to be, and it will give us a particular resolution on things. So I'm sorry if that was a complicated explanation, but actually it is simple at bottom. It's all to do with how information represents itself to us when we make an observation. But we must remember that that is a subjective collapse of the waveform. The objective collapse is the thing in and of itself, and that does what it likes, independently of our observation.
That explains it beautifully. To just translate something that's going through my head, then it looks to me, when the way you framed it there, that Jung, like he often did, created another polarity. There's causal Newtonian physics, and there's, say, the acausal connecting principle. I still find it quite difficult to get the idea of the acausal connecting principle out of my head, because you're absolutely right, it does limit things down immediately. And like when a synchronicity happens, it's like not a mystical event, but there's like something different and special and immediate about it. But what your reframe from the ground up seems to suggest is it's just another form of informational expression in the environment, and that's the ground state is what you're talking about, rather than having to jump to this construct of synchronicity.
Yes, and if we want to model it, we can collapse, so to speak, into a synchronistic framework. But if we don't know what the problems with synchronicity are, we become the problems of synchronicity, including the gaps and the woo-woo and the not being able to explain anything. Whereas what is what is perceived happens, unless of course it is only an internal event and it is projected. And this is a big hint, because we can see then how information is trying to represent itself through projection and transference. So what the psychodynamic people call ego consciousness. It's trying to represent itself. It can't get through. There is some kind of dynamical resistance, which we know what that is. That's complexes and dissociation. So it projects into the environment, as if to say, if you won't see it in yourself, see it in the other. That's an opportunity. And then if you don't see that, we'll have to somaticize, we'll turn up in your body. Well, you're not seeing that. Okay, well then we'll have to ramp up synchronicities. The trickster will be there, the trickster function, because the trickster is an image, is an imago, is a reification of something which is a natural process. Parapsychological events, these are all resolutions of the same phenomenon. All of this is an attempt to balance out the representation of information to an individual's consciousness. And if they fail to do that, they're in a state of neurosis. It's as simple as that. When they're in harmony with the waveform of information flow, right, then they stop being neurotic.
Cool.
It's
cool.
that simple.
Cool. Yeah, that takes a lot of the constructs I had going into this conversation. It just goes, you don't need any of those, really. So thinking about that comet, it's at the start of the Bayeux Tapestry, isn't it? The comet 106666. Yeah. So that in the sky, there's no need then to have an internal model of this is either synchronicity or this is projection, and there's some kind of mechanism from the core part being from the perspective of the ego modeling it to try and fit it into, say, a Newtonian mechanics mechanism somehow. It simply is what it is. Get the constructs out of your head and accept what it is first, and then downstream modeling through forensics, etc., can then follow on from that. But it seems like this might just be personal or not, but it seems the most fundamental thing you're saying here is the constructs themselves need to be questioned first, because they're built from the perspective of the ego.
Yes.
And there's more outside of the ego.
Yeah. I mean, Jung was brilliant, and he was wonderful, and he has his place in history, and it's absolutely fantastic. But the minute you stop projecting or transferring onto him and then look at what he did, then certain limitations, which are all too human, start to emerge. And that's a problem for people sometimes, because they've invested so much of their own potential in the figure of Jung that they don't want to see. It's a very, very narrow focus. They don't want to see what the problems were. A lot of what he did was based on his personality. It's in the conversation with Eric Goodwin yesterday, Professor Goodwin, I mentioned how Freud had an insight into instinct, an intuition, perhaps we could call it in the broader sense, rather than reducing that to Myers-Briggs Jungian terminology, but an intuition and apperception of the power of instinct. But then it met his personality, that intuition. The intuition was the raw state of information flow. And once it hit his personality, it collapsed into Sigmund Freud, literally. And then what came out the other side of that was something filtered through Sigmund Freud's personality.
Sure.
And so we got instinct reduced to sexuality and aggression, and that's nonsense. It's far more than that. It includes it, but it's far more than that. And then as his model developed, it started to take on characteristics of his own inertia. And it's the same with Carl Jung. It's the same with pretty much anyone that makes a very personal statement about a psychological model. It necessarily takes on their complexes. And Jung's were religious. He never really gotten over his father complex. No. Hence Ion and alchemy and all the rest of it was this massive, massive attempt to try to square his relationship to his father and to the kind of impressions that he received from him. Most of it's completely irrelevant in any objective sense to anybody else's life. Clinically, it means nothing, sadly. But he felt he had to do it, and that's fine because that was his personal myth. So the Jungian material that's not overly processed through his personalities is still pretty good, but a lot of it isn't, because it doesn't solve an ordinary person's life at all. It doesn't help them adapt. So we have to look for as objective a position as possible. I mean, he made some brilliant insights. He really did. But Jung didn't apologize for being Carl Jung. He said, you know, he is what he is. And he did what he did. And he didn't care if anybody else liked it or not. That's a huge hint. The whole thing was his personal myth.
Yeah. Very, very idiosyncratic guy.
Yeah, as was Freud. And obviously they were never going to get on because they were way, way too different and way, way too personal. And this is why people need to know the history of the psychodynamic movement. Ellen Berger's book, The Discovery of the Unconscious, The History of Dynamic Psychiatry. That's fabulous, but you need to know more even than that. You need to go really into the background of those lives, because their theories are not independent of them and of their personalities. And Jung himself was clear about it. He didn't really hide anything. It's just that people create a vacuole within which to hide themselves and then not be exposed to the fullness of that man's life.
If people aren't projecting onto Jung, maybe in equal numbers or perhaps far more, they're going to be projecting onto these UFOs, UAPs, whatever they happen to be in reality, instead of religious stuff or Jungian stuff, little green men who come from Mars. Is the mechanism behind that very similar to the more sort of religious style of projection, insofar as whatever science fiction elements someone has picked up over the course of their life almost forms what we could colloquially call a mythology that's projected out to try and make sense of what is present, perhaps a meta-instinctual framework underpinning it, but sci-fi itself becomes its own mythology, I guess would be the right word to use.
I used to say that when I was very young, I mean, I was a kid when the original Star Trek started in 1967. I remember saying to my mother, I said, "Oh, look, Mum, Romans with ray guns." In that moment, it twigged with me. Yeah, really, we used to in the past, in our mythology, project into the past. The golden age was in the past. Now we project into the future, but we carry the past with us. And those mythological elements are there. Then 10 years later, Star Wars came along, and it was openly that way, really. As were other things, Buck Rogers and the rest of it. So there is a link up between that which is projected into sci-fi and mythology. It's a continuum, for sure. So people should, and I'm sure they are, be very aware of that. But do they want to get into the depth of it and say, what's the real meaning of this? Why am I doing it?
You triggered off another question in my mind, if you don't mind. We talked about zombies recently as this image that people will project onto and internalize. Star Wars is obviously immensely popular. It's as popular as it's ever been, has been for 50 years or so, approaching 50 years. Yes. And George Lucas is as far as I'm aware, the richest celebrity in the world. So obviously there's elements of Star Wars that are, you know, not necessarily the reason why it is so popular, but there's something to do with space, definitely, that's there. We see that in lots of big budget movies. We see it in Star Trek, as you've mentioned. Is there something similar about the idea of the spaceship or an astronaut in space that's similar to, say, not the same meaning obviously, but like a zombie or like a werewolf or like a vampire? Is there something in that, and there's a reason why that particular image has been so popular over the last, I guess, 20th century and into the 21st?
Yeah, I would say that if we follow the idea that there's a continuum with, say, for example, Greek mythology and Star Trek or Star Wars, there is a line there is a lineage there, then it's going to be fulfilling the same kind of thing. And so you're going to have the dramas, the normal dramas you get in Greek mythology, but you're also going to get that drive to explore. So the seeking system is going to be pushing as well. And it seems that it's a very effective vessel to represent it, but it also conceals as much as it reveals. And that's the problem when a myth becomes a fantasy. Then it moves away from the imagination, and imagination is something which is prepared for the future.
Mm-hmm.
If we're thinking of the future and trying to generate something new, I would say that's imagination. If we just stand still or move sideways or go backwards through inertia, then that's fantasy, and fantasy doesn't solve anything.
Yeah.
Except it provides a sandbox within which to play and rehearse things, but it becomes habitual and we get stuck. So in that sense, it is similar. You know, a zombie that we were suggesting is that there's an often overlooked element of that, which is that it's about unlived life, not about the undead. And the degree to which we haven't lived our potential, then it comes for us, and it comes in a very frightening form, because fear in that context is about shocking the ego into realizing what it should do or could do. I think similarly with a lot of the way that these mythic representations occur in sci-fi as well. To boldly go where no man has gone before. I mean, that the opening line in Star Trek, that's a definition of a seeking system. It's an attempt to say, get out there and do something, be a pioneer, be an individual, but people watch it and don't do it. So that they're stuck in that repetition loop.
Yes.
So yeah, there are psychodynamic elements for sure in there.
Yeah, like I obviously don't get bogged down on this for too long, but I remember back in my own primary school days being on the playground pretending to be a Jedi or whatever. And I remember for it must have been for a few years, there was a culture amongst the lads of not having any interest whatsoever in say medieval or the fiction fantasy to do with the past. That was almost like wrong. There's something taboo about it. But space and exploring the stars, that was something that everyone really, really enjoyed. And I'm wondering if that could be, if there's an instinctual thing behind that, as you're saying, because when you're young, you're rehearsing for the future to go out and explore, to become oneself, to see what the world has to offer. And there's more potentially in the image to project into of sci-fi than there might be into projecting into the past, which might be something that someone's more interested in when they grow a little bit older, without wanting to be prescriptive about it. But would that be a rough initial framework to begin interpreting that?
Yeah, I mean, to go to other worlds, if that were possible, would be the ultimate in the seeking system, because of the virtually, you know, in terms of us as individual biological organisms, it's virtually infinite by all practical considerations. So the extent is infinite. That allows your imagination, but unfortunately also fantasy, to inflate infinitely as well. So it's a great playground. Whereas if you have a historical fantasy, you're kind of locked in by the conditions of that. But you get something like Game of Thrones, which is a fantasy which is loosely based on a historical scenario, then you've got more latitude, because you can infinitely expand that within boundaries. But history says no, that didn't happen. You have to operate within those tolerances. So that's more constraining. And as you say, as you get older, you'll probably be more interested in history because it is real, and that is likely to be a compensatory dynamic to bring down the potential to inflate into fantasy or into an unrealistic application of imagination. We need to know what real dangers are and not to inflate beyond our capacity to survive. So that's probably something that's operant there.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, then to return back to the UFO stuff, then, because I think we have to go into this. If let's presume for a moment that there are, no one projects anything at all. That we're not. Yeah, whatever is being shown is what's being shown. There's no element of projection at all. How have you got any thoughts on that side of things? Not sci-fi per se, but these things are physically, materially real, as described as an unidentified flying object.
Yeah, there's the null hypothesis is it's simply advanced technology from, say, the US, which is like a CIA psyop, and you will believe this is that while we get on and develop it, and that's plausible. It's plausible, but given the amount of time where this technology appears to have existed, it goes way, way back. And if the US had it then, it would probably be more advanced now. And any culture that has an advantage will use it in an evolutionary sense. There would be no issue with Russia. There'd be no issue with China. America will absolutely dominate and control everything everywhere. So it's unlikely. And the serious, and I call them serious people, I've seen scientists who've discussed this, when they try and step back and be objective, say there is something there because it's being recorded simultaneously through different recording media, as I say, infrared, microwave, and so on, and it moves between them. It moves that if it were a physical object, according to our physics, it couldn't survive, it would break up. Nothing biological could survive the G-forces. So it's likely to be what we might conceive of as being artificial intelligence, or maybe beyond even that. It might be beyond our capacity to understand. And then I remember seeing a Dutch Air Force guy, an F-16 guy, who'd chased some of these things in the 1990s. And he said his view was the following: they're constructed, in other words, they are real, they're intelligently directed, and they're beyond anything we've got. That leaves you with very few solutions to that. It's either not of this world or not of this time, or both. And both of them, he said, are uncomfortable, but the facts present in that way. And I think that the best mind should focus on solving that rather than moving into fantasy or conspiracy theories or whatever it might be. I feel for sure that there's going to be advanced technology out there that's accessible to, say, the US government, and there's going to be psyops about that. The Americans have always done that. That's part of what they do. It's in their nature, it's in their national character to do that kind of thing. But this seems to be beyond anything that's even remotely imaginable that's within immediate reach.
Yes, yeah, I like that way of thinking about these things, because I guess two things arise for me. I mean, one of them is I think Jung says it as well, actually, back in 1958 when he wrote his Flying Saucers little pamphlet thing. Even back then, these flying objects were described as traveling so fast that if they were manned by anybody, they'd be instantly killed by the momentum and the acceleration, etc. That's the same now. So the technology surely would have evolved. And why would they be showing this off? Because one of the links that or one of the things we talked about recently around this, haven't these things been reported as deliberately, overtly messing with something that human beings are doing?
Yeah, this is checkable. There are people who have come out of the woodwork after well over 50 years, 55 years, to do with Minuteman missile silos in the US, where they were shut down, several of them. And the people who were in charge of that are coming out and saying this did happen, not once, not twice, several times. And I've heard stories of the reverse of that from the Soviet Union. And I heard this years ago, actually. And I'm not a ufologist, but I'll just make this clear. But I picked up on the claim that was being made that in the Russian case, the Soviet case, they were switched on and were about to launch and could not be switched off. And then this thing, wherever it was, this object hovering above the base, switched them off, as if to say, we could fire these if we want. We can shut them down if we want. So I would recommend people look at some of those links that we sent, and there are some serious people, serious scientists, who are using logic and deduction to work this out. and say that there is something here, it is real, and it's in several different signatures of representation. You could call that an informational superpositioning, perhaps, in how it presents. And really, people should try and sort this out, because it could open up all sorts of things for us to understand about ourselves.
Yes, yeah. From that ground state, which you've been talking about for the last little while now, of removing those constructs and removing the fantasy to begin to do that on both the sci-fi side and on the psychological side. That's so useful. Then I think there's a bit of common sense that people can use to sense out what these things may or may not be. It's like that null hypothesis that you mentioned there about it's, could potentially be some drone program from the United States. That seems so unlikely, or feels so unlikely to me, because of everything we've just been talking about there. Well,
one of those links, this is a relatively recent one, was the US Navy account, which has been discussed publicly, and it's the Pentagon apparently have said that they believe that they were being swarmed by over 100 drones at one point, these ships, but witnesses have come forward, sailors, seamen, officers and ratings, who were operating equipment at that time, and have said no way. In fact, they used anti-drone technology to try and bring them down, and it was pointless. It wouldn't work. And also the characteristics of the movement of these things are beyond anything that's known. So there is a cover-up going on, that some information is being let out, because if people do that, they can manipulate the control and the flow of information. And as we know, that the best way to utilize suggestion, to make it effective, is to direct that at instincts. And the way to do that is the way any hypnotist would do it, and that's to make the information that you give nebulous, because you then invite the person to make some kind of sense of that. And if you do that within a framework that suggests fear, for example, then people will immediately default to the negative outcome for protective purposes. It'll be, I want to prepare for the worst, so this is a problem. It's been done recently over that worldwide health scare, the manipulation of fear and instinct to control behavior on a large scale. So if you then say, well, look, these are drones, but they're not ours, then it's another country. It's China, it's Russia, whoever we want to hate at the moment. And therefore people get concerned that there is another nationality here, another political bloc, which has got more technology than us, and it can buzz our ships at will, and it can do all sorts of incredible things. That means we're vulnerable. And again, that will appeal to instinct negatively, and people will say whatever the government want them to say because of the belief and the instinct that's been triggered. That's how to do it. It's so economical if you want to change a herd's behavior. Just appeal to instinct. If you frighten a herd of animals, they move as one. And we're not that different.
Nope. That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Through the dialectic, things can actually sort themselves out. That stuff on synchronicity and the construct stuff was a genuine click in my head, which I'd not really thought about per se before. Gaining consciousness, so they say.
Yeah, it doesn't contradict Jung, does it? But it's just that he doesn't go far enough. When he talks about the unconscious having teleology, purpose, and awareness, he's saying it's not unconscious; it's just differently conscious. So okay, that's fine. Therefore, and the information theory model and the superpositioning between angle states and so forth, and the waveform element, the collapse of it according to perception. There's an objective and a subjective waveform, and that just simplifies things. If people just get hold of that, so, right, okay, I can relax now and start to find out how to become more conscious.
Well, the relaxing element is, that's important as well, because synchronicity seems to have with it an artificial sense of urgency. I say artificial as well because there's like a natural way to experience a real phenomenon, and then there's what someone has learned on top about what synchronicity may or may not be. And I've known because I've known of Jung for 5-6 years now. In those early years before I met yourself and Pauline, it would almost be superstition straight away.
Yeah,
I know it's supposed to be scientific from Jung's point of view, but it's not the way it's discussed. It is a lot of the time superstition and projection and all kinds of stuff. So your way of explaining it sorts out all of that stuff de facto. It's brilliant.
Thank you. And of course, why it's in that mess is that his primary intuition, in that broad sense, was filtered through his personality and collapsed into it.
Yeah.
And it's the same with Plato. You know, Plato's intuition about form, I think he was onto the right thing. I think he had a great intuition, but he couldn't go beyond his times. And then there was his personality, so it collapsed into that. And Jung's the same. You know, unfortunately, in a way, it kind of got processed through him, and it came out that way. And it's the same with Freud.
You mentioned Plato. I've been reading Plato yesterday, I think.
Really go synchronicity. There you go, the information.
Yeah. You're right about Plato. I was reading this will be relevant. Phaedo. The one Socrates is just before he's about to die or be executed. And when Plato talks in there about his intuition of why forms must exist, it's like a world of forms, that's pristinely brilliant. And then it's page after page after page as to why life and death are opposites to each other. And there's a lot of almost like justification of life after death or life before death, where it becomes literal, where you can see the intuition gets funneled down, exactly as you're saying, into his own personality. And because it's written as a dialectic, you can see how it's happening and how Socrates some of the time is pacing and leading almost like a hypnotist.
Yeah.
Really, really cool to see.
Once you've got that, I think as a framework, it liberates you, because you can listen to anybody without undue influence at that point. And then if you're going to be forensic and you want to investigate something, you take that with you. And it doesn't matter what they say, because you're looking for that deep structure waveform and seeing where it appears. And that links all the evidence together and you get your picture. And that's how to work with complexes.
Mm-hmm. I found this conversation personally hugely valuable. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for drawing it out.
Always an absolute pleasure. And if I just want to ask the audience for a moment, any topics that you'd like to see us discuss on this channel, please just let us know in the comments down below.
Really look forward to that. Thank you again, James, and thank you everyone for watching. Blessings.
Take care.